I want to tell you something I never said out loud for most of my 13-year portrait photography career. The majority of my photos were soft. Not dramatically blurry, and not obviously broken, just never quite as sharp as I wanted them to be. I blamed my lenses, I got them serviced, I purchased sharpening software that promised miracles and didn't deliver anything close. And the whole time, the answer was in my camera settings, not my editing software. Today I'm going to tell you what I wish someone had told me a decade ago. By the end of this video, you're going to know exactly what's causing your soft photos. And it's probably not just one thing. It's a combination of three. And once you know what they are, you can start fixing them one at a time without purchasing any new camera equipment or any new editing software. If you're new here, welcome. I'm Karen. I taught myself photography and I built a 13-year portrait business. And I'm here to make photography so much less complicated to learn. If you want a shortcut to better photos starting today, my free Easy Lighting Guide walks you through the 5 lighting setups that covers 90% of what you'll ever shoot. So your photos have a clean, sharp foundation that no editing tool can fake. The link is in the description and it's completely free. But first, let me tell you about a session that I still cringe to think about because it's a perfect example of what happens when you don't know what causes your soft photos, but you keep shooting and hoping anyway. I thought this photo shoot was one of my very best sessions. The look and feel was light and airy. I was using a low aperture and it was so beautiful in the moment. But when I got home and pulled all my images up on my full-size monitor, I could tell that one eye was in focus and one was out of focus, and the person's nose and lips were soft, and all the details weren't exactly the way that I was hoping they would be. Did it look pretty good overall? Well, sure. But is it exactly what I wanted to get out of that session? Absolutely not. And the problem wasn't the editing. The problem was 3 things happening inside my camera simultaneously. And at the time, I didn't know what any of them were. So let's talk about what the 3 culprits are for soft photos. Any one of these will cause your images to not be as sharp as you'd like them to be. But when all 3 problems are happening at the same time, every single session is a gamble. So let's dive right in and talk about culprit number 1, shutter speed. This is the silent factor that doesn't get mentioned often enough. Most beginners assume that soft photos means it's a focus problem, but oftentimes it's just motion blur. Because here's the thing, nothing is ever truly still, unless you're photographing a rock. As we're shooting our subject, we are moving and breathing, and we may not even realize how much we sway back and forth. Our cameras can sometimes be heavy, and we may not always be using a tripod. And oftentimes your subject is moving because they're breathing as well. Even if it's not obvious movement, any movement during even a fraction of a second of that exposure equals motion blur that can look like missed focus. There's a rule that says if you're using a certain millimeter lens, you should also match that with the shutter speed. Meaning if you're shooting with a 200 millimeter lens, you will want to set your shutter speed to at least 1/200. But I find in reality that this really isn't fast enough. So I will often set my shutter speed to at least 1/250 for portraits, and oftentimes higher if my subject is moving. If I'm photographing kids that are running around, I will often set my shutter speed to 1/500. Now, these are just starting points, and I've realized that sounds like a really fast shutter speed, and you're probably already thinking this is going to give us a lot less light in our exposure triangle, so we're going to have to bump up our ISO or reduce our aperture to let in more light. And as you know, a higher ISO is going to introduce more grain to your image, but a soft, grainy photo beats a smooth, blurry one any day, because you can reduce grain in editing a lot easier than you can manufacture sharpness that was never there to begin with. Culprit number 2 is aperture and distance working against you. Shooting at a low aperture like f1.8 from 3 feet away only gives you about 3 to 4 inches in your plane of focus, which is even smaller than the length of this pencil. So all the details that you want to get in sharp focus in your image need to fit inside this small plane of focus. If you miss it by even a hair, one eye could be in focus and the other one isn't. And that's exactly what happened during that cringy session of mine. So the fix is back up a little bit farther and consider raising your aperture slightly. Even an aperture of 2.8 or 3.5 gives you significantly more room inside that plane of focus. Simply backing up 5 or 6 feet from your subject, even when you're using a low aperture like f1.8, gives you about 8 to 10 inches in your plane of focus, which is about the size of this paper. And think about it this way, if you're trying to get your subject's face fully in focus, your subject's face fits almost entirely in this plane of focus, and it's unlikely you're going to miss the details that you're trying trying to capture. Of course, if you're shooting multiple subjects at the same time, you want to try to line them up side by side so they're all within that same plane of focus. Anyone closer or farther away in that plane of focus may result in having softer details. So the general rule is give yourself at least 5 to 6 feet. Oftentimes, more space between you and your subjects result in sharper images. And you can still get a beautiful blurry background in your portraits using an aperture of 2.8, as long as you have proper spacing. So it doesn't have to be all or nothing. Culprit number 3 is focus points and focus modes. Many DSLRs will give you the option to choose how many autofocus points you want displayed over your viewfinder while you're shooting. My camera goes up to 61 autofocus points, but if I were to choose autofocus point selection, my camera may not understand that I want my subject's eyes in sharp focus, but oftentimes the camera will focus on sharp contrast, or whatever's closest, or the bird that flew behind in the background. But even if you do choose your own autofocus points, another issue can be the technique where you focus and recompose. This may feel like a logical thing to do, but it's actually one of the fastest ways to miss focus consistently, because when you're using your autofocus point in the center of your viewfinder and you lock focus on your subject and then move your camera around to recompose your shot, your focal plane shifts, so your subject may no longer be where your focus landed. A better approach may be to manually move your autofocus point directly where you want it, and that may be your subject's eyes, and then you don't have to recompose your shot. Focus modes matter a lot here too. If you're shooting on a Canon, the focus mode one shot, or AFS with Nikon, locks and holds focus for stationary subjects, and this is often used for portraits where your subject is sitting or standing still. Using AI servo on a Canon or AFC on a Nikon is meant to track continuous movement. So this is great for sports or any subject that's moving, but this may include things that you don't want it to chase. So for portraits where people are standing or sitting still, using one shot or AFS mode and manually placing your focus point where you want it to be, maybe your subject's eyes, that's the setup. Let's talk about the editing sharpness trap. I spent way too many years chasing sharpening software that promised to fix missed focus, but it turns out it's not really that great at it. At least before the days that we had AI. I would look at the before and after photos that they would put on these websites to advertise their software, and the examples always looked incredible. But the thing was, most of the images that they used in their examples were only slightly out of focus to begin with. But when you apply that sort of software to shots that genuinely missed focus, you end up with weird, overly contrasty, not really sharp results. And a telltale sign of an over-sharpened portrait is looking at a person's eyes. When over-sharpening software has been used on somebody's eyes, they tend to look like a bullseye because the whites are so white and the darks are so dark. The contrast is unrealistically high, and that certainly doesn't look natural. And then there's the software that's built into Photoshop and Lightroom specifically for sharpening your images. And I found that they helped slightly soft images look a little sharper, but that's pretty much it. Sharpening your images in post-processing should be a finishing touch, not a repair to the structure of your photo. If you get focus right in your camera, editing can just be for polishing your photo, not relying on it as a rescue mission. How do we check for sharpness in the field while we're out on our sessions? In the early days of my career, I didn't check my images in my camera until long after the client had left. But when I got home and pulled up all of my images on my full-size monitor, that's when I started feeling that sinking dread that I had royally screwed up my session. But the habit that saved me from this was checking my images during my session. Once you've set your settings at your location and you're in a certain spot, see what your results are on the back of your camera. And if you're moving around from place to place at the same location, check your settings after every transition to make sure you're not missing something because you left your settings the way that they were in another spot. If you're shooting portraits, zoom in on your screen and make sure the eyes are in focus, or at least make sure they're in the range of focus that you need them to be. And you won't fully trust what your camera screen shows you, and you shouldn't, but it catches the obvious problems before they compound or ruin your session. And if something looks off in your test images, start by fixing one thing, then take another test shot and check again. Catching soft focus early beats chasing sharpening software at midnight when your client is long gone. I also want to talk about how lighting connects to sharpness in your photos, because lighting and sharpness don't seem connected, but they very much are. In low light situations, autofocus systems struggle. They hunt around, they may lock in on the wrong thing or fail to lock at all. But when there's better light, there's more contrast and detail for autofocus to work with, and this results in faster, more accurate focusing. And well-lit photos also reduce the need for high ISO, which means less grain in your photos and cleaner images overall. And a properly lit photo looks sharper and cleaner before sharpness is even technically the thing that you're looking at. See, lighting creates the conditions where sharpness is even possible. It's the foundation that everything else sits on. So sharp photos aren't a gear problem or an editing problem. They're a settings problem, specifically shutter speed, aperture and distance, and your focus point setup. Fix those 3 things and your images will look different. Not because you bought something new, but because you finally know what's been working against you the whole time. The easy lighting guide is linked below. Go grab it and go take some sharp photos. And if you made it this far, drop me a comment below and tell me which of these 3 culprits have given you the most trouble: shutter speed, aperture, or focus modes. And I'll see you next time.